So the other day, I had stumbled upon the fact that Angular comes with this format_date function, which allows us to apply a robust set of date masks to a date timestamp in order to output it in a particular format. And in the discussion of that post, I talked about the fact that we use Moment.js at work pretty often, and like 95% of those use cases are using the fromNow method in order to create a relative time string. And given the fact that format_date exists in Angular, I wanted to see if I could essentially eliminate the Moment.js functionality by creating my own fromNow function. And you'll see that I have this fromNow, which takes a date input, which can be a date or a millisecond timestamp or a parsable string. And from that, I'm going to return a string value, which would be like just a few seconds ago, a minute ago, and then various date calculations. And it turns out that the Moment.js documentation actually tells you exactly what buckets it's going to use for its different strings. So for example, between 0 and 44 seconds ago, it's going to use the static string a few seconds ago. But if we were to, say, have 90 minutes to 21 hours ago, then it's going to use a dynamic 2 hours ago to 21 hours ago. So we have these different buckets, seconds and minutes and hours and days and years, but if we squint hard enough, we can actually collapse these different time units into a single time unit, milliseconds. And we can do that by roughly translating each one of those units into a static millisecond value. So for example, we know that a second is 1,000 milliseconds, and we know that a minute is then 60 times that, and an hour is 60 times that. But when we start to get into the days and months and years, we have to do a little bit of squinting because we have things like leap seconds and leap years and months of different durations and then months of different durations during different leap years and so on and so forth. But let's just roughly say that a month is 30 days worth of millisecond days, and a year is 365 days worth of millisecond days. And we can do this because the entire concept behind the fromNow method is a rough translation into these buckets, right? We're already roughly translating a day ago to mean anything between 22 hours and 35 hours. So the fact that we're going to be a couple of milliseconds off here and there, maybe a day off here and there, it's really not going to come through in the user experience. So once we have this rough translation of these units into a single unit, the millisecond, we can then calculate these buckets using those millisecond units. So for example, the fromNow, which is the 0 to 44 seconds, is just anything below 44 millisecond seconds. And then let's say, for example, the a day ago, which is between 22 and 35 hours, we can say the day ago is anything less than 35 millisecond hours, right? And we can start to calculate these maximum cutoffs for each one of these particular buckets. And once we have these maximum cutoffs, then the fromNow method essentially becomes a massive if-else-if block, right? So what we're doing is we're taking a date input, we're getting the current tick count, or the milliseconds since epoch, we're getting the value tick count, so the tick count for the given value, and then we're just calculating the delta. So this is the milliseconds between now and that particular date. And once we have that delta, you can see this delta just feeds in to this if-else-if block. And all we're trying to do is look at each one of these successively larger millisecond cutoffs and trying to figure out which one we need to fall into. And some of these return a static value, like a few seconds ago, a minute ago, an hour ago, and some of them require some calculation. And for the calculation, all we have to do is take the math ceiling of the delta divided by the essentially the most accurate divider. So for example, if we're looking for minutes, we divide by the millisecond minutes. If we're looking for months, we divide by the millisecond months, and if we're doing it by years, we divide by the millisecond years. And we do the ceiling, not the floor, because we already have the singular use cases are static. So we don't ever want to accidentally round down to something that says 1 and then has a plurality of years or months or days and so on and so forth. So that's all there is to this math calculation. So we take this kind of big fuzzy concept of translating times into human-friendly strings, and if we roughly translate that into milliseconds, and then we roughly translate those milliseconds into cutoff buckets, then the math between going from a date to a string actually becomes fairly straightforward. So to test this, I put together a simple app component that has a couple of demos, and each demo is just a minimum millisecond value, a maximum millisecond value, and then a from now translation essentially. And each one of these, I have 4 demos here, and each one of these demos just has a increasingly more recent from value. So we start with 10 years ago, then we have a year ago, then we have a day ago, then we have an hour ago, and you can see that each one of those is just the minimum value: years ago, year ago, day ago, hour ago. And each one of these demos is then going to correspond to a HTML input range selector, right? So here we have our HTML template, and we're going to loop over those demos, and then each one of these demos becomes a type range, with the min and the max being the millisecond minimum and the millisecond maximum. Each one of the maximums is just now. And you can see that every time the range is updated, we call this update from now. And if we jump back over here, we can see that the update from now does nothing but convert that string value to a millisecond number, and then call our from now date helper method, translate that into a string, and then that string now is what's getting output in the browser. So let's jump into the browser now, and let's just refresh. So here's the lowest granularity, or the finest granularity, and you can see that we have a few seconds ago, and as we start to do it, we're in minutes, and the minutes are increasing. At some point we'll hit 44, right? And then after 44 we jump into the hour ago, and that's because if we jump back here into our date helper, we can see that the just now is the from now minutes stops at 44, right? So while we're under 44 minutes, we're in the from now minutes, right? We're in here. But then when we cross over into the from now hour and we jump down, we can jump down to where that is. The from now hour becomes the static an hour ago, which is why when we pass 44 minutes and then go a little bit farther, we jump into the hour ago. So then here we're going back a whole day, and you can see we have minutes, becomes an hour, then becomes multiple hours, then becomes a day ago. And then here's the month, so we're in seconds, that quickly becomes minutes, then hours, and then days, and then months, and then a year. And then here we're 10 years, and you can see we're very quickly jumping into months, then quickly jumping into years. And there you go. So we've taken the Moment.js from now function, and I think pretty successfully translated it into an Angular implementation that actually has quite a little bit of logic, or sorry, has very little logic into it. The complexity is really just understanding how to take the different buckets and translate them into a condensed millisecond time unit, and then how to take that millisecond time unit and bucket it into the right set of buckets. And there you go. So at this point, between the native format date, which I'm just prefixing here with ng so that I don't collide with my own format date, between the native format date and this function here, I think I can probably get rid of Moment.js altogether. I'm sure it has other things in it, probably like adding and subtracting date values. But the date constructor, the native JavaScript date constructor can really do all that stuff for us pretty easily. So anyway, just a fun exploration. It's nice to see that we can replace something that seems very complex maybe on the outset, but as we dive into it, we can see that it's actually just a little bit of math and some simple if-else statements. So fun stuff.